Bullies tried to attack the McDonald's worker. Big mistake. She got revenge. The fluorescent lights of the McDonald's on Riverside Boulevard cast harsh, unforgiving shadows across the worn linoleum floor, their constant electrical hum mixing with the rhythmic beeping of fryers and the distant sound of traffic from the busy street outside. Behind the scratched plastic counter, barely visible above the towering register display, stood Arya Chen, a petite figure whose 5'2" frame seemed almost swallowed by the navy blue uniform that hung loosely on her slender shoulders. At 23, Arya possessed the kind of quiet elegance that would have been striking in different circumstances. But here, under the brutal efficiency of fast food lighting, she appeared almost translucent, like someone trying desperately to fade into the background of her own life. Her straight black hair was pulled back into a regulation ponytail, secured with a simple elastic band that had lost its elasticity weeks ago, but continued to serve its purpose through sheer stubborn necessity. Despite the grease-laden air that permeated every surface of the restaurant and the constant chaos of lunch rush service, her uniform remained meticulously clean and pressed, a small act of defiance against the entropy that seemed to govern everything else in this place. The attention to detail in her appearance wasn't vanity, it was armor. Each carefully pressed seam, each perfectly aligned name tag, each precisely positioned hair clip represented hours of preparation in her tiny studio apartment, standing before a cracked mirror and trying to transform herself into someone who belonged in this foreign landscape of American fast food culture. The ritual had become as essential to her daily survival as breathing, a way of maintaining some semblance of control in an environment where she felt increasingly powerless with each passing day. Around her neck hung a delicate golden cross pendant, no larger than her thumbnail, that caught the artificial light in brief, precious flashes as she moved between register and preparation areas. The necklace was one of the few tangible connections she maintained to her previous life, a gift from her late grandmother, Popo, who had pressed it into Arya's small hands during her final visit to the hospital 3 years ago. For protection, Popo had whispered in Mandarin, her weathered fingers trembling as they closed around Arya's. Not from others, but from forgetting who you are. The irony of that blessing wasn't lost on Arya now, as she stood in this sterile corporate environment, feeling more disconnected from her identity than she ever had in her 23 years of life. Every day seemed to chip away another piece of the person she had been in Cedar Falls, where her name commanded respect in martial arts circles, and her presence could silence a room full of competitive fighters with nothing more than a demonstration of perfect technique. Here, in Riverside City, she was nobody. Worse than nobody, she was actively unwanted, a target for frustrations and prejudices that she was only beginning to understand. The transition had been far more brutal than anything her small-town upbringing had prepared her for, despite her grandfather's careful warnings about the challenges she might face in a larger, more diverse urban environment. Arya had been working at this particular McDonald's location for exactly 6 weeks and 4 days. She had been counting, marking each shift survived on a small calendar hidden in her employee locker like a prisoner marking time until release. The job was supposed to be temporary, just a way to keep food on the table and rent paid while she figured out her next move in this sprawling concrete maze of a city. She had arrived in Riverside with nothing but 2 battered suitcases, a laptop that was older than some of her co-workers, and dreams that felt increasingly naive with each day that passed. The contrast between her current circumstances and her previous life felt like whiplash. 6 months ago, she had been Arya Chen, 3-time national champion in competitive kickboxing, respected instructor at Cedar Falls Martial Arts Academy, and beloved granddaughter to the man who had raised her since her parents died in a car accident when she was 7 years old. Her trophy case had gleamed with gold and silver medals from tournaments across the Midwest, and her classes at the academy were always full of eager students who hung on her every word as she demonstrated techniques that had taken her 15 years to perfect. The decision to leave Cedar Falls hadn't been made lightly. After her grandfather's minor heart attack, which the doctors assured them was a warning rather than a crisis, Arya had realized with crystal clarity that she needed to build a life independent of the safety net he had provided for her entire adult life. Yeye wouldn't be around forever, and she owed it to both of them to prove that his investment in her education and training had created someone capable of thriving on her own. "You have wings now, little bird," he had told her during one of their final conversations before her departure, his English still colored by the accent that decades in America had never quite erased. "But you must learn to fly beyond the nest, even when the sky seems dark and unfamiliar." The metaphor had seemed beautiful and inspiring at the time. Now, standing behind a fast food counter and feeling like those wings had been systematically clipped by 6 weeks of casual cruelty and systemic indifference, Arya wondered if she had been catastrophically naive about her ability to navigate a world that seemed determined to reduce her to the most superficial aspects of her appearance and heritage. The breakfast rush had ended 20 minutes ago, leaving the restaurant in that strange liminal space between peak service periods where the frantic energy of survival gave way to a more insidious form of stress, the anticipation of whatever fresh hell the lunch crowd might bring. Arya used these quieter moments to restock supplies, clean equipment, and mentally prepare herself for the next wave of customers, some of whom had become all too familiar over the past weeks. Her co-workers moved around her with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of minimum wage employment. Most of them were teenagers, kids like Marcus Webb, a 17-year-old high school senior who worked evenings and weekends to help his single mother pay bills, or Jessica Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, a bubbly 16-year-old who treated every customer interaction like a performance opportunity and somehow maintained genuine enthusiasm for even the most mundane aspects of food service. These young people possessed a natural resilience that Arya both admired and envied. They seemed capable of bouncing back from difficult customers, management criticism, and workplace drama with the kind of emotional elasticity that she remembered having once but could no longer access. Whether this was a function of their age, their different cultural background, or simply their lack of experience with the particular type of targeted harassment she had been enduring, she couldn't say. But she watched them with something approaching fascination, trying to understand how they maintained their spirits in an environment that felt increasingly toxic to her own well-being. The one exception to this teenage resilience was Luna Martinez, a 17-year-old high school senior who worked weekend shifts and had developed what could generously be called a nodding acquaintance with Arya. Luna was tall and athletic, with the kind of natural confidence that came from being good at both academics and sports, but there was something in her dark brown eyes that suggested she understood the particular challenges of being an outsider in seemingly familiar territory. Luna's family had moved to Riverside City from a smaller town in Texas when she was 14, and while her experience was obviously different from Arya's, there was an unspoken recognition between them, the kind that existed between people who had both navigated the complex process of rebuilding their identities in new environments. They rarely spoke beyond work-related communication, but Arya had noticed that Luna made an effort to position herself nearby during the difficult interactions with certain customers, as if her presence might provide some small buffer against the worst behavior. The shift manager, Kevin Rodriguez, was a different story entirely. Kevin was 32 years old and had been working in fast food management for over a decade, a career trajectory that had given him the particular combination of cynicism and conflict avoidance that seemed endemic to middle management in service industries. He was neither actively cruel nor particularly kind, simply absent when his presence might actually matter, more concerned with avoiding corporate complaints than with protecting his employees from harassment or creating a positive work environment. Kevin had perfected the art of selective blindness, a skill that served him well when dealing with situations that might require him to actually manage rather than simply react to the most obvious problems. When difficult customers created scenes, Kevin would inevitably find urgent paperwork that required his immediate attention in the back office. When employee conflicts arose, he would schedule separate shifts to avoid dealing with the underlying issues. When harassment occurred, he would suggest that the targeted employee try to be more accommodating, as if the solution to being systematically degraded was to become better at accepting degradation. This management style had created an environment where problems festered rather than being addressed, and where the most vulnerable employees, those who couldn't afford to quit or didn't have other options, were left to navigate increasingly hostile situations without support or protection. It was a system that functioned perfectly well for corporate metrics like turnover costs and customer satisfaction scores, but created a daily reality that felt more like psychological warfare than legitimate employment. Arya had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when Kevin was about to disappear from the floor. The slight tightening around his eyes when he spotted certain customers entering the restaurant, the way he would suddenly develop intense interest in inventory spreadsheets, the casual drift toward the back office that always seemed to coincide with the arrival of people who had established patterns of problematic behavior. She had stopped expecting him to intervene weeks ago, but the disappointment still stung each time he proved her low expectations correct. The restaurant itself was a study in corporate efficiency designed to extract maximum profit while providing minimum comfort for either employees or customers. The seating area featured hard plastic chairs in primary colors that were easy to clean but uncomfortable for extended periods, ensuring rapid customer turnover during peak hours. The walls were decorated with promotional posters for menu items and corporate initiatives, all featuring impossibly diverse groups of impossibly attractive people enjoying impossibly appetizing food in impossibly clean environments. The disconnect between these marketing images and the reality of daily operations was so profound that Arya sometimes felt like she was working in an elaborate theatrical production where everyone had forgotten they were performing roles. The corporate messaging spoke of family values, community connection, and celebrating diversity, while the actual experience involved isolated employees serving increasingly processed food to customers who often treated them as barely human obstacles between themselves and their orders. Behind the counter, the workspace was a maze of equipment that seemed designed by someone who had never actually worked in food service. Fryers were positioned just close enough to prep areas to ensure that everyone would be constantly at risk of burns, but just far enough apart to require constant movement between stations. The cash registers were ancient by technology standards, requiring a complex series of button combinations to accomplish even simple tasks, while the drive-through headsets produced a constant stream of static that made communication challenging even under ideal circumstances. The break room was a windowless cube furnished with a single table, 4 mismatched chairs, and a bulletin board covered in corporate communications about everything from new menu items to revised uniform policies. The fluorescent light fixture had been flickering for 3 weeks, creating a strobe effect that gave Arya headaches during her 15-minute breaks, but apparently wasn't enough of a problem to warrant maintenance attention. The refrigerator made concerning noises and had a tendency to freeze anything placed too close to the back wall, while the microwave had mysterious stains that no amount of cleaning seemed capable of removing. This was the environment where Arya spent 40 hours each week, trying to maintain her sanity while earning barely enough money to cover rent and basic expenses in a city where the cost of living seemed designed to ensure that service workers remained permanently trapped in poverty. The work itself wasn't particularly difficult. She had worked various jobs throughout high school and college, and she understood the basic requirements of customer service. But the combination of physical exhaustion, psychological stress, and systematic dehumanization was wearing her down in ways that were becoming harder to ignore. More troubling than the general difficulties of the job was the specific pattern of harassment that had emerged during her second week of employment, when she had first encountered the trio that had since made her shifts into exercises in endurance and self-control. Blake Morrison, Ethan Walsh, and Madison Pierce had initially seemed like just another group of difficult customers, the kind of people who treated fast food workers as convenient targets for their frustrations with their own lives. But their behavior had quickly escalated beyond general rudeness into something more focused and personal, a campaign of systematic degradation that seemed designed to drive her away from the job entirely. Blake Morrison was the obvious leader of the group, a 27-year-old man whose physical presence dominated any space he entered. Standing 6 feet tall, with the kind of broad shoulders that spoke of high school athletic success, he carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone who had learned early that size and volume could substitute for actual authority in most social situations. His dirty blonde hair was cut in a style that had been popular during his teenage years and never updated, while his pale blue eyes held a cruel intelligence that made Arya's skin crawl every time they focused on her. Despite being 5 years removed from his high school football career, Blake still wore his varsity jacket like a talisman against the reality of his current circumstances. The faded leather sleeves and outdated patches announced to anyone within sight that his glory days were permanently in the past, but he clung to them with the desperation of someone who had never figured out how to create an identity beyond his teenage achievements. The jacket was more than clothing. It was armor against the uncomfortable truth that he had peaked before his 20th birthday and had been declining ever since. His face might have been conventionally handsome, if not for the permanent sneer that seemed etched into his features like scar tissue from old disappointments. There was something fundamentally bitter about his expression, as if he had been promised things that the world had failed to deliver and had decided that someone needed to pay for that betrayal. When he looked at Arya, she could see the calculation in his eyes, the assessment of her as a safe target for frustrations that had nothing to do with her, but everything to do with his own sense of diminished prospects and social irrelevance. Blake's employment history, from what Arya had overheard during his loud conversations, consisted of a series of jobs that had ended badly due to conflicts with supervisors, co-workers, or customers. He currently worked part-time at an auto parts store, a position that seemed to provide just enough income to support his lifestyle of perpetual adolescence while giving him plenty of free time to spend harassing service workers who couldn't fight back without risking their own economic survival. His constant companion was Ethan Walsh, a man who served as both audience and amplifier for Blake's worst impulses. Ethan was shorter and thinner than Blake, with nervous energy that manifested in constant fidgeting and an eagerness to please that made him dangerous in his desperation for approval. His brown hair fell across his forehead in greasy strands that suggested either poor hygiene or deliberate styling choices, and his clothes always seemed slightly too large for his thin frame, giving him the appearance of a child playing dress-up in adult clothing. Where Blake's cruelty seemed to stem from anger and disappointment, Ethan's participation appeared motivated by his desperate need for social acceptance. He was the kind of person who had probably been bullied himself during his school years, and had learned that the easiest way to avoid being a target was to help identify and isolate new victims for the more naturally aggressive personalities in his social circle. His laughter was always too loud, his comments always designed to escalate rather than diffuse tension. And his phone was always ready to record moments of conflict that he could later share for social media validation. Ethan worked sporadically as a delivery driver for various apps, a job that seemed perfectly suited to his inability to maintain consistent employment or develop meaningful relationships with co-workers. The gig economy allowed him to avoid the kind of workplace accountability that might have forced him to examine his behavior, while providing enough income to support his lifestyle of following Blake around and participating in whatever entertainment they could create at other people's expense. The third member of their toxic triumvirate was Madison Pierce, whose beauty was as carefully constructed as it was fundamentally hollow. With artificially blonde hair that required weekly salon visits and makeup applied with the precision of a professional artist, she represented everything that was seductive and dangerous about superficial attractiveness. Her green eyes were undeniably striking, but there was something cold and calculating behind them that suggested her external beauty was being used to distract from some fundamental emptiness within. Madison's cruelty was perhaps the most disturbing of the three because it felt so calculated and purposeful, while Blake's aggression seemed to stem from his own insecurities and Ethan's participation appeared motivated by his need for acceptance. Madison's behavior felt like genuine sadism, as if she derived authentic pleasure from watching other people suffer and had learned to use her attractiveness as a weapon to inflict maximum psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. She worked as a receptionist at a dental office, a position that seemed to provide her with just enough authority and social status to fuel her sense of superiority over service workers, while requiring just enough customer service skills to make her harassment feel professional and systematic. Her complaints about Aria's service were always phrased in the language of legitimate customer concerns, making them difficult to challenge without seeming defensive or unreasonable. Together, these three individuals had formed a partnership that felt specifically designed to make Aria's life as miserable as possible while staying just within the bounds of behavior that could be dismissed as difficult but not illegal. They had turned harassment into an art form, each interaction carefully calibrated to chip away at her confidence and sense of belonging, while providing them with entertainment and social bonding opportunities. Their visits had become as predictable as the lunch rush itself, usually occurring during the early afternoon when the restaurant was busy enough to provide an audience, but not so busy that their behavior would significantly disrupt operations. They would enter with the swagger of people who owned the space, settle into their preferred corner booth near the children's play area, and begin their systematic campaign of psychological warfare that had evolved and intensified over the weeks of Aria's employment. The harassment followed patterns that Aria had begun to recognize and dread. It would start with comments about her appearance, observations about her accent, speculation about her background, critiques of her customer service skills that were phrased just carefully enough to sound like legitimate feedback rather than racial harassment. Then it would escalate to more creative forms of torment. Deliberate mispronunciations of her name, requests for her to repeat herself in her native language, and loud conversations about immigration and employment that were clearly intended for her to overhear. The psychological sophistication of their approach was what made it so devastating. Each individual comment could be dismissed as innocent curiosity or legitimate customer concern, but the cumulative effect was overwhelming. They had created a form of torture that was almost impossible to challenge without seeming oversensitive or paranoid, while systematically destroying her sense of safety and belonging in what was supposed to be her workplace. What made their behavior even more insidious was the way they had weaponized social media and recording technology. Ethan's phone was always ready to capture her reactions to their provocations, creating a permanent record that could be edited and shared to support whatever narrative they wanted to create about her behavior or competence. The constant threat of being filmed meant that Arya lived in a state of perpetual performance anxiety, never knowing when something she said or did might be taken out of context and used against her online. The impact on her mental health had been profound and frightening. Arya had always prided herself on her emotional resilience. 15 years of competitive martial arts had taught her how to manage stress, channel aggression, and maintain focus under pressure. But this situation was different because she couldn't fight back, couldn't defend herself, couldn't use any of the skills that had made her feel confident and capable in her previous life. Instead, she was forced to stand there and absorb whatever abuse they chose to inflict, smiling and maintaining professional courtesy while her self-esteem eroded a little more each day. The helplessness was perhaps the worst part, not because she was actually powerless, but because she had chosen to accept powerlessness in order to maintain employment and honor the promise she had made to her grandfather about using her skills only for legitimate self-defense. That promise had been made during their final conversation before her departure from Cedar Falls, in the small apartment above the martial arts academy that had been her home for 16 years. The space was filled with photographs from tournaments, certificates of achievement, and training equipment that had become as familiar as furniture over the years of her development as both a martial artist and an instructor. "Arya," her grandfather had said, his weathered hands grasping hers with surprising strength despite his 87 years and recent health scare. "You have been blessed with abilities that few people possess. But with great power comes great responsibility, and in America, you must be even more careful than you would be here." Ye had immigrated to the United States in the 1960s, part of the wave of Chinese students who came to pursue higher education and ended up building lives far from their birthplaces. He had worked his way through engineering school while supporting a young family, eventually establishing the martial arts academy that had become both his livelihood and his passion. His English was still accented after 5 decades in America, but his understanding of American culture and its particular challenges for people who looked different or spoke differently was profound and hard-earned. "People will not understand your skills," he had continued, his dark eyes, so similar to her own, filled with both pride and concern. "They may see them as threatening, dangerous, foreign. Some will try to provoke you into using them inappropriately, hoping to confirm their prejudices about people like us. You must be stronger than their ignorance. You must be better than their expectations." The conversation had taken place in his small kitchen, surrounded by the smells of tea and traditional Chinese medicine that had been the backdrop of most of their serious discussions over the years. Arya could still remember the weight of his hands on hers, the intensity of his gaze, the sense that this was more than advice. It was a transmission of wisdom that had taken him decades to acquire through experience. "Promise me," he had said, "that you will use your training only for discipline and self-defense. Promise me that you will not let anger or pride lead you astray. Promise me that you will remember that true strength is not in defeating others. It is in controlling yourself when others try to defeat you." "I promise, Ye," she had whispered, tears streaming down her face as she realized this might be the last time she would see the man who had shaped her into the person she was today. "I will only fight when I have no other choice. I will focus on building a peaceful life." Now, standing behind a fast food counter and feeling that promise become a chain that bound her to accepting abuse she could easily prevent, Arya wondered if her grandfather's wisdom was sufficient for the challenges she was actually facing. The philosophy of turning the other cheek worked well in theory, but in practice it seemed to be enabling Blake and his friends to escalate their behavior without consequences. The lunch rush was beginning to build, and Arya could feel the familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach as she prepared for whatever fresh torment the afternoon might bring. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether it would be a difficult day. The particular quality of light coming through the restaurant's windows, the energy level of her co-workers, the mix of customers who had already come through during the morning shift. Today felt ominous in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it was the way Kevin had avoided making eye contact during the morning shift meeting, or the nervous energy she sensed from Luna during their brief interaction at the beginning of her shift. Maybe it was simply the accumulation of weeks of stress finally reaching a breaking point, but Arya found herself feeling more on edge than usual as she prepared for the day ahead. The first customers of the lunch rush were regulars, office workers from nearby businesses who came in with specific orders and efficient interactions that required minimal emotional energy to navigate. Arya served them with the professional courtesy that had earned her positive performance reviews from management, but she found herself constantly glancing toward the entrance, waiting for the inevitable arrival of Blake and his companions. They didn't keep her waiting long. At exactly 12:47 p.m., Arya had learned to note the time of their arrivals as a way of tracking the patterns of their harassment. The door chimed with the electronic tone that announced new customers. Blake Morrison swaggered through the entrance first, his varsity jacket catching the artificial light and his pale blue eyes scanning the restaurant like a predator assessing territory. Behind him came Ethan Walsh, already pulling out his phone with the eager anticipation of someone expecting entertainment, and Madison Pierce, whose perfectly applied makeup and designer clothing seemed calculated to emphasize the contrast between her obvious success and Arya's minimum wage employment. Together, they represented everything that was toxic about privilege and entitlement wrapped in the guise of legitimate customer behavior. "Well, well, well," Blake announced loudly as he approached the counter, his voice carrying the kind of volume that demanded attention from everyone within hearing distance. "Look who's still here, McDonald's little diversity hire." The words hit Arya like physical blows, each syllable designed to reduce her from a human being with thoughts, feelings, and dignity to nothing more than a checkbox on some corporate inclusion metric. She forced herself to maintain eye contact and keep her voice steady, drawing on years of competitive experience to remain calm under pressure. "Hello, welcome to McDonald's," she said, the script rolling off her tongue automatically like a shield of professional courtesy that she hoped would deflect the worst of what was coming. "May I take your order?" Around her, she could sense her co-workers developing sudden, intense interest in tasks that would take them to other areas of the restaurant. Marcus found urgent inventory work that required his immediate attention in the stockroom, while Jessica discovered that the lobby needed intensive cleaning that couldn't wait for the usual schedule. Even Luna, who usually made an effort to stay nearby during these interactions, seemed to have been assigned to drive-through duties that kept her physically separated from the main counter area. Kevin Rodriguez had already vanished into his office with the suspicious timing that had become his signature move whenever Blake's group arrived. Through the small window in the office door, Arya could see him intently studying what were probably the same inventory reports he had been reviewing all week, his attention apparently too focused on paperwork to notice the disruption occurring just 20 feet away. The abandonment was complete and predictable, leaving Arya alone to face whatever Blake and his friends had planned for today's entertainment. She tried to remind herself that this was temporary, that she just needed to get through the interaction, and then she would have the rest of her shift to recover before potentially facing them again. But each encounter seemed to chip away a little more of her resilience, and she was beginning to wonder how much more erosion she could withstand before something fundamental inside her broke. "Yeah, I'll have a Big Mac," Blake said, leaning against the counter in a way that invaded her personal space while maintaining just enough distance to avoid obvious physical intimidation. And make sure there's no weird foreign spices on it this time. I know you people like to put all kinds of strange stuff in food, but this is America. We like our food American." The comment was carefully crafted to sound like a legitimate dietary preference, while actually being a thinly veiled attack on her heritage and belonging. It was the kind of statement that she couldn't challenge without seeming oversensitive, but that made her feel diminished and othered in ways that were difficult to articulate to anyone who hadn't experienced similar treatment. Ethan and Madison erupted into the kind of exaggerated laughter that suggested they had been waiting for this moment, their amusement feeling performative and cruel rather than genuinely spontaneous. Several other customers glanced over with expressions ranging from discomfort to disapproval, but none made any move to intervene. This was the bystander effect in action, the psychological phenomenon that Aria had studied in her college courses but never expected to experience so personally and repeatedly. "We don't add any additional spices to our Big Macs," Aria replied quietly, her fingers moving automatically across the register keys to enter his order. The familiar motions gave her something concrete to focus on besides the mounting tension in her chest and the way Blake's presence seemed to suck all the breathable air out of the immediate vicinity. "Oh, she speaks!" Madison exclaimed with mock delight, clapping her hands together as if Aria had performed some amazing trick worthy of applause. "And in English too! Your pronunciation is getting so much better. You must be practicing really hard." The condescension in Madison's voice was thick and sickening, delivered with the kind of false sweetness that made it sound almost like a compliment to anyone who wasn't paying careful attention to the actual meaning behind the words. Aria had been born in San Francisco, had grown up speaking English as her primary language, and had graduated summa cum laude from her state university with a degree in communications. But none of those facts mattered to these people, who saw only what they wanted to see, a convenient target for their prejudices and frustrations. "What else can I get for you?" Aria asked, directing the question to all three of them, while carefully avoiding direct eye contact with Blake. She had learned through painful experience that looking at him too directly seemed to trigger something aggressive in his behavior, as if he interpreted her gaze as some kind of challenge that needed to be met with increased hostility. "I'll have a quarter pounder," Ethan chimed in, his phone now openly recording their interaction with the kind of obvious excitement that suggested he was expecting something particularly entertaining to occur. "And hey, can you say quarter pounder in your native language? I want to post it on my TikTok. My followers love this authentic cultural stuff." The request was so absurd and offensive that Aria felt a momentary flash of anger pierce through her carefully maintained composure. Her native language was English, spoken with the same Midwestern accent as most of her customers, but explaining this would only provide them with more ammunition for their harassment, so she simply continued taking their orders without acknowledging Ethan's request. The strategy of non-engagement was one she had developed over weeks of trial and error, learning through bitter experience that any response, whether defensive, explanatory, or confrontational, would only encourage them to escalate their behavior. They were looking for reactions, for evidence that they were getting under her skin, for content that would make their harassment feel justified and entertaining. The best defense she had found was to treat them with the same professional courtesy she would show any other customer while refusing to give them the emotional responses they were clearly seeking. "And I'll have a chicken sandwich," Madison added, then leaned forward with the kind of conspiratorial body language that suggested she was about to share something particularly important. "But can you make sure whoever makes it washes their hands first? I've heard that some cultures have different hygiene standards, and I'm really particular about that kind of thing." Each comment was carefully crafted to sound just plausible enough that Aria couldn't definitively call it out as harassment without seeming oversensitive or paranoid. They were experts at walking the line between outright abuse and behavior that could be dismissed as innocent cultural curiosity or legitimate customer concerns. It was a sophisticated form of psychological torture that left Arya feeling gaslit and questioning her own perceptions of reality. As she punched in their orders and calculated their total, Arya found herself analyzing their body language with the same critical eye she had once used to assess opponents in the ring. Blake's stance was aggressive, but not immediately threatening, weight slightly forward on the balls of his feet, shoulders back in a display of dominance, hands loose at his sides, but ready to gesture or point for emphasis. He was posturing, trying to intimidate through presence and volume rather than preparing for actual physical confrontation. His confidence came from the knowledge that social conventions and economic necessity protected him from any real consequences for his behavior. Ethan's nervous energy was more pronounced today, manifesting in constant shifting from foot to foot and frequent glances around the restaurant as if looking for an audience to appreciate his performance. His phone remained prominently displayed, though he wasn't actively recording at the moment. The threat of being filmed was almost worse than actual filming because it kept Arya constantly on edge, never knowing when something she said or did might be taken out of context and used against her online. Madison was perhaps the most dangerous of the three because her cruelty felt so calculated and purposeful. While Blake's aggression seemed to stem from some deep-seated insecurity about his own failures, and Ethan's participation appeared motivated by his desperate need for approval, Madison's behavior felt like genuine sadism. She enjoyed the psychological manipulation for its own sake, finding authentic pleasure in watching Arya struggle to maintain her composure while being systematically degraded. "Your total comes to 2347, Arya said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart and the way her hands had begun to tremble almost imperceptibly as adrenaline flooded her system. "Will that be cash or card?" Blake made an elaborate show of pulling out his wallet, moving with deliberate slowness while maintaining direct eye contact in a way that felt like a challenge or a threat. The gesture was designed to prolong the interaction and create additional opportunities for harassment while demonstrating his control over the pace and tone of their encounter. "Cash," he said, then began counting out bills one at a time with the kind of exaggerated care that suggested he was either mentally impaired or deliberately wasting her time. Each bill was examined carefully, smoothed flat, and placed on the counter with theatrical precision while he provided a running commentary on his counting process. 1, 2. What comes after 2? Blake asked with false confusion, his voice loud enough to carry to nearby tables where other customers were trying to enjoy their meals. "They probably teach numbers differently in your country, right? Like, do you use those weird symbols instead of regular numbers?" The performance was humiliating not just because of its obvious intent to demean her, but because of the way it forced everyone else in the restaurant to become unwilling participants in her degradation. Other customers could see what was happening, could hear the obvious harassment, but the social dynamics of the situation made intervention almost impossible. Speaking up would require them to confront strangers, potentially escalate the situation, and involve themselves in drama that had nothing to do with their own lives. Arya could feel her face heating up with embarrassment and suppressed anger, but she forced herself to remain still and silent while Blake continued his counting performance. Any reaction would only encourage them and provide more entertainment for their cruel game. Instead, she focused on her breathing, in through her nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through her mouth for 6. It was a technique her grandfather had taught her for maintaining calm during competition, and it served her well now in this very different kind of battle. The breathing exercise transported her momentarily back to the dojo in Cedar Falls, where she had spent countless hours learning to control not just her body, but her mind under pressure. Fighting is 10% physical and 90% mental, Yeye had told her during one of their training sessions when she was struggling with pre-competition anxiety. The strongest opponent you will ever face is your own fear, your own anger, your own desire to quit when things become difficult. Those lessons felt both relevant and inadequate now. The mental discipline was serving her well in maintaining composure, but the situation felt fundamentally different from anything her martial arts training had prepared her for. In competition, there were rules, referees, time limits, and clear objectives. Here, she was trapped in an open-ended psychological warfare scenario where her opponents faced no consequences for their behavior, and she had no acceptable options for defending herself. The counting performance continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Blake seemed to be enjoying himself immensely, clearly drawing energy from her obvious discomfort and the growing line of customers behind him who were becoming increasingly impatient with the delay. Finally, with exaggerated flourish, he completed his count and handed over the exact amount, making sure their fingers touched when she took the money. The contact was brief, but deliberately invasive, another small violation designed to make her feel powerless and uncomfortable. His skin felt cold and slightly damp, and there was something predatory about the way he lingered just a moment too long before releasing the bills. The gesture was subtle enough that anyone watching would see only a normal transaction, but intimate enough that Arya felt contaminated by the contact. "Keep the change," he said with mock generosity, though there was no change to keep since he had paid the exact amount. "I know times must be tough for your people, what with taking jobs away from real Americans and all." The comment stung not just because of its obvious racism, but because of its fundamental unfairness. Arya was a real American, born in this country to parents who had themselves been American citizens. Her grandfather had immigrated legally in the 1960s and had worked his entire life to build a better future for his family. She had as much right to be here and to work here as anyone else in the restaurant. But rights and reality were two different things, and the reality was that she needed this job to survive in a city where she knew almost no one and had no other immediate options for employment. Getting into an argument with ignorant customers would only result in her being fired, and then where would she be? Homeless and jobless in an unfamiliar place, with no references and no way to explain to future employers why she had been let go. "I'll have your order ready shortly," Arya managed to say, turning away to prepare their drinks while fighting back tears of frustration and humiliation. Her hands were shaking more noticeably now, and she hoped they wouldn't see the tremor in her movements as she filled large cups with ice and soda. Behind her, she could hear them settling into their usual booth, a corner table near the children's play area that gave them an unobstructed view of the service counter and allowed them to continue their commentary throughout their meal. The location was strategically chosen to maximize their ability to make her work environment as uncomfortable as possible while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. The booth had become their unofficial headquarters for these harassment sessions, a place where they could observe her work, make loud comments for her to overhear, and plan their next moves in the ongoing campaign to make her life miserable. Other customers had learned to avoid that area when Blake's group was present, unconsciously recognizing the toxic energy that emanated from their corner of the restaurant. As she worked to prepare their food order, Arya caught fragments of their conversation, each comment designed to be just loud enough for her to hear, while still allowing them to claim they were speaking privately among themselves. The technique was another sophisticated form of psychological torture, creating a constant stream of degrading commentary that she couldn't ignore, but also couldn't legitimately complain about without seeming paranoid or oversensitive. "I don't understand why they even hire people like that," Madison was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone of false confusion that bigots used when they wanted to seem reasonable while expressing unreasonable views. I mean, there are so many Americans who need jobs, real Americans who actually belong here. It's all about the quotas, Blake replied, with the confident authority of someone who had never bothered to research the topic he was discussing, but felt qualified to speak about it anyway. Companies get tax breaks or something for hiring foreigners. It's all part of the liberal agenda to replace American workers with cheap foreign labor. That's so unfair, Ethan chimed in, his voice filled with the kind of manufactured outrage that came from consuming too much social media propaganda without developing the critical thinking skills to evaluate its accuracy. Like my cousin has been looking for a job for months, and then they give this one to someone who probably doesn't even have a social security number. Each statement was factually incorrect, but correcting them would require Arya to engage with their conversation in a way that would only provide them with additional opportunities for harassment. She was a legal American citizen with a valid social security number, employment authorization, and all the documentation required for legitimate employment. The McDonald's Corporation didn't receive tax breaks for hiring foreign workers, and there were no diversity quotas governing fast food employment decisions. But facts were irrelevant to people whose goal was harassment rather than genuine communication. Blake and his friends weren't interested in learning about immigration law, employment practices, or the actual circumstances of Arya's life. They were interested in creating a narrative that justified their cruelty and made them feel superior to someone they perceived as different and therefore threatening to their sense of social order. Arya closed her eyes briefly, reminding herself that their ignorance was not her responsibility to correct and that engaging with their misconceptions would only make her situation worse. She was not a spokesperson for all immigrants, all Asian Americans, or all McDonald's employees. She was simply a person trying to do her job and earn enough money to pay rent while figuring out her next steps in an unfamiliar city. The food preparation took longer than usual because her hands kept shaking, forcing her to slow down and concentrate on each task to avoid making mistakes that could give them legitimate ammunition for complaints about her work performance. The last thing she needed was to provide them with actual evidence of incompetence that they could use to justify their harassment or get her fired. As she worked, she found herself slipping into the mental state that had served her so well during martial arts competitions, a kind of focused detachment where she could observe her own emotions without being controlled by them. In kickboxing, emotional control was everything. Let anger take over and you became sloppy, making mistakes that your opponent could exploit. Let fear dominate and you became hesitant, missing opportunities and leaving yourself vulnerable to counterattacks. The key was to acknowledge the emotions without letting them drive your decisions, to remain calm and strategic, even in the face of aggression. But this situation was fundamentally different from competition because she couldn't fight back. In the ring, when someone tried to hurt her, she could defend herself with everything she had learned and trained for over 15 years of dedicated practice. Here, she was defenseless by choice, bound by social conventions, economic necessity, and the promise she had made to her grandfather to simply absorb whatever abuse they chose to inflict. The constraint felt like wearing handcuffs in a boxing match, technically voluntary, but practically devastating to her ability to protect herself from harm. When their order was finally ready, Arya arranged everything carefully on a tray and approached their table with the same professional demeanor she would use for any other customer. The walk across the restaurant felt like crossing a minefield, with every step potentially triggering some new form of harassment or humiliation. "Here's your order," she said simply, setting the tray down within reach and turning to walk away as quickly as possible without appearing rude or unprofessional. "Wait," Blake called out, his voice sharp with authority that brooked no argument. "I think you forgot something." Arya turned back, scanning the tray carefully to see what might be missing. Everything appeared to be in order. 3 sandwiches, 3 drinks, the appropriate number of napkins and condiment packets. She had been extra careful to include everything they had ordered, knowing that any oversight would be seized upon as evidence of her incompetence. "I'm sorry, what did I miss?" she asked, genuinely confused about what complaint they might have this time. "A smile," Madison said sweetly, her voice dripping with false concern and manufactured kindness. "The customer service here used to be so much better. People were friendly, made you feel welcome. Now it's all very cold, unwelcoming, unfriendly." The criticism was particularly cruel because Arya had been specifically complimented on her customer service by several managers during her brief tenure at the restaurant. She was naturally polite and helpful, often going out of her way to ensure customers had positive experiences, even when dealing with difficult requests or complicated orders. But around Blake and his friends, every instinct told her to minimize interaction and avoid giving them additional opportunities to harass her. The tension between providing good customer service and protecting herself from abuse was constant and exhausting, requiring her to make split-second calculations about how much friendliness was safe to display without encouraging further harassment. "I apologize," Arya said, forcing her facial muscles into something resembling a smile that felt more like a grimace. The expression felt foreign and uncomfortable, a mask that she was being forced to wear for their entertainment. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" "Much better," Blake said approvingly, as if he were training a pet or coaching a child through a difficult lesson. "See how easy that was? A little effort goes a long way in customer service. Maybe they don't teach that where you come from, but here in America, we believe in being friendly to our customers." The condescension was thick enough to cut with a knife, but Arya simply nodded and retreated back to the counter area as quickly as she could manage without appearing to flee. Every step away from their table felt like a small victory, but she knew the reprieve was temporary. They would finish their meal eventually, but they had shown no pattern of leaving immediately after eating. Instead, they typically lingered for an hour or more, maximizing their opportunities for harassment while treating the restaurant like their personal entertainment venue. As Arya finally escaped back to the relative safety of the counter area, she felt the familiar burn of humiliation in her chest, a sensation that had become as much a part of her work experience as the smell of French fry oil and the sound of the drive-through timer. She glanced at the clock and realized she still had 4 hours left in her shift, 4 more hours of potential encounters and manufactured confrontations. The lunch rush was intensifying around her, providing some distraction from the ongoing psychological warfare being conducted from the corner booth. New customers arrived with legitimate orders and normal human interactions, reminding her that not everyone in the world was committed to making her life miserable. These regular customers, office workers, retirees, families with young children, treated her with basic courtesy and respect, making their orders efficiently and moving on with their lives without feeling the need to comment on her appearance, heritage, or right to exist in their space. The contrast between normal customer interactions and Blake's harassment was stark, and somehow made the abuse feel even more abnormal and unacceptable. When people treated her like a human being, it highlighted just how dehumanizing Blake's behavior really was, and made her question why she was accepting treatment that would be unthinkable in any other context. During her 15-minute break, Arya retreated to the small employee break room and pulled out her phone, scrolling through old photos from her life in Cedar Falls, with the desperate hunger of someone dying of thirst, looking at pictures of water. There she was, standing proudly with her tournament team, gold medals gleaming around her neck and her face radiant with the confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she was capable of achieving. In another photo, she was demonstrating a complex combination technique to a group of young students at the Martial Arts Academy, their faces filled with admiration and respect as they watched her move with the fluid precision that had taken years to develop. The children in those classes had never questioned her right to be there, never suggested that she didn't belong, never made her feel like she needed to apologize for taking up space in the world. I was someone there, she thought, the words echoing in her mind with painful clarity. Here, I'm nothing. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she could hear her grandfather's voice correcting her with the gentle firmness he had always used when she was being too hard on herself. You are never nothing, Arya. Your worth does not come from what others think of you or how they treat you. Your worth comes from who you choose to be when faced with adversity. That is when character is revealed, not in moments of triumph, but in moments of struggle. The wisdom was sound and had sustained her through many difficult times during her competitive career, but it provided little comfort when she was living that struggle day after day without any clear end in sight. The constant vigilance required to navigate Blake's harassment was exhausting in ways that physical training had never been. At least in the gym, when she was tired, she could rest. Here, letting her guard down even for a moment could result in being caught off guard by some new form of humiliation or cruelty. As her break ended and she returned to the floor, Arya noticed that Blake's group had finished eating, but showed no signs of leaving. This was part of their established routine, lingering far longer than necessary to maximize their opportunities for harassment while turning her workplace into their personal entertainment venue. They had effectively claimed ownership of that corner of the restaurant, creating a hostile environment that affected not just Arya, but other customers and employees who had to navigate around their toxic presence. The afternoon shift brought new challenges as Kevin assigned Arya to lobby duty, cleaning tables, emptying trash cans, maintaining the general cleanliness of the dining area, and ensuring that the restaurant met corporate cleanliness standards. It was work she normally didn't mind, as it kept her moving and provided some variety from standing behind the register for hours at a time. But with Blake's group still occupying their corner booth, every task became an exercise in psychological endurance. As she worked her way around the dining room, wiping down tables and sweeping up crumbs left by previous customers, she could feel their eyes tracking her movements like predators watching prey. The sensation was unsettling and invasive, making her hyper-aware of her body language and movements in ways that felt fundamentally dehumanizing. Occasionally, one of them would make a comment just loud enough for her to hear. Observations about her cleaning technique, speculation about her background and family situation, or critiques of her work performance that were designed to chip away at her confidence and remind her that she was being constantly judged and found wanting. Each comment was like a small psychological paper cut, individually minor but collectively devastating in their cumulative effect on her mental state. "Look at her scrubbing those tables," Madison observed with false admiration during one of Arya's cleaning rounds. "She's so thorough. I bet they really emphasize attention to detail where she comes from. Different work ethic, you know. Very industrious." The comments were carefully phrased to sound like compliments, while actually being deeply condescending and othering. The implication that her work ethic was somehow foreign or different reinforced their narrative of her as an outsider who didn't quite belong in American society, even when she was doing exactly the same work that any other employee would be expected to perform. Blake picked up the thread with his characteristic lack of subtlety. "Yeah, it's like she's grateful for the opportunity. You can tell she really appreciates being able to work here, not like some people who think they're entitled to good jobs just because they were born here." The irony of Blake, a man whose own employment history consisted of a series of failures and conflicts, lecturing anyone about work ethic and entitlement was profound, but pointing out that irony would only provide them with additional opportunities for harassment. Arya continued her cleaning routine, moving methodically from table to table while trying to block out their commentary. The breaking point came when Arya was carrying a tray of half-empty drink cups toward the trash can, navigating carefully around the scattered chairs and tables that customers had left in various states of disarray. The tray was heavier than usual, loaded with the remnants of the lunch rush, and required careful balance to transport safely across the uneven floor. As she passed Blake's booth, moving as quickly as possible while still maintaining control of the tray, he casually extended his foot into her path with the kind of calculated casualness that made the action appear accidental to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. The timing was perfect. His foot appeared just as she was committed to her current trajectory, making it impossible for her to avoid the obstacle without dropping the entire tray. Arya stumbled, her carefully maintained balance destroyed by the unexpected obstruction. The tray of half-finished sodas flew from her hands, sending sticky liquid cascading across the tile floor in a spectacular crash that seemed to echo through the entire restaurant. Ice cubes scattered like diamonds across the surface, creating a slippery hazard that would require immediate attention, while the acidic smell of spilled cola began to permeate the air. The crash drew immediate attention from everyone in the dining area. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as customers turned to stare at the source of the commotion, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to obvious concern for the young woman now kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the evidence of what appeared to be a clumsy accident. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of liquid dripping from tables and chairs onto the already saturated floor. Arya found herself on her hands and knees, her clean uniform now soaked with sticky soda that would stain and smell for the rest of her shift. The cold liquid had penetrated through to her skin, making her feel uncomfortable and self-conscious in ways that went beyond the simple physical discomfort. More than that, though, was the emotional impact, the crushing weight of public humiliation that came from being reduced to a spectacle for other people's entertainment. "Oops," Blake said with exaggerated concern, his voice dripping with false innocence as he surveyed the destruction he had caused. "Sorry about that. Guess they don't teach coordination in your country either. Maybe you should be more careful where you're walking." The laughter that followed felt like physical blows raining down on her from multiple directions. Ethan was openly recording with his phone now, capturing her humiliation for posterity and probable social media sharing. His device was positioned to get the best possible angle of her kneeling on the floor in her stained uniform, surrounded by the debris of her accident. Madison was covering her mouth as if trying to hide her amusement, but her eyes were bright with genuine enjoyment of Arya's predicament. There was something almost predatory about her expression, as if she were savoring every moment of the degradation and filing away details to be savored later or shared with other friends who would appreciate the entertainment value of someone else's suffering. "This is perfect," Ethan said gleefully, adjusting his phone's position to capture different angles of the scene. "My followers are going to love this. Foreign worker can't even carry a tray without making a mess. This is going viral for sure." As Arya knelt there, gathering the scattered cups and trying to contain the spreading mess with napkins that immediately became saturated and useless, she felt something fundamental shift inside her mind. For weeks, she had absorbed their abuse with patience and dignity, telling herself that maintaining her composure was a form of strength, and that enduring their cruelty without retaliation proved her moral superiority. But in this moment, surrounded by the evidence of their escalating harassment and feeling the cold soda seeping through her clothes while they laughed at her humiliation, she began to question whether her grandfather's advice about avoiding conflict applied to a situation where the conflict was being forced upon her regardless of her choices. The promise she had made was about not starting fights, but did it really require her to accept this level of abuse when she had the skills to defend herself? She could feel the pressure points on Blake's body as clearly as if they were highlighted in neon. The vulnerable spot just below his kneecap, where a precisely placed kick could bring him to the ground instantly. The nerve cluster in his shoulder that could be manipulated to cause temporary paralysis in his dominant arm. The exact angle and force needed to use his own weight and momentum against him and send him sprawling across the floor in a humiliating reversal of their current positions. The knowledge was both comforting and torturous. Comforting because she wasn't truly powerless, torturous because she had promised not to use that power except in the most extreme circumstances. But what constituted extreme circumstances? How much abuse was she expected to absorb before defending herself became not just acceptable, but necessary? "Hey, shouldn't you be thanking me?" Blake continued, his voice growing louder as he sensed her lack of response and decided to escalate further. "I'm giving you the authentic American experience here. This is how we welcome immigrants who come here and take jobs away from hard-working Americans. You should be grateful for the cultural education." The comment was so outrageously offensive that several nearby customers visibly recoiled, their expressions shifting from mild curiosity about the accident to obvious disapproval of Blake's behavior. But disapproval was a far cry from intervention, and none of them made any move to actually challenge his harassment or offer Arya any support. "I'm not taking anyone's job," Arya finally responded, her voice quiet but firm as she continued to clean up the spill. The words came out before she could stop them, breaking her usual pattern of silence in the face of his provocations. "There was a job opening, I applied, and I was hired. That's how employment works." She immediately regretted speaking up, knowing that any response would only encourage him to escalate further and provide additional entertainment for his cruel performance. But something about the injustice of his accusation, the implication that she was somehow stealing opportunities from more deserving people, had finally pushed her past the point where silent endurance felt possible. "Oh, it talks back," Ethan hooted with delight, adjusting his phone to get a better angle for recording her response. "Come on, say something else in that funny accent. My followers eat this stuff up. They love seeing authentic immigrant reactions to American culture." The request was dehumanizing in its casual cruelty, reducing her to a performing animal expected to provide entertainment on command. Ethan's followers, whoever they were, had apparently developed an appetite for watching vulnerable people be humiliated, and he was happy to provide content for their consumption, regardless of the human cost involved in creating it. Madison leaned forward with predatory interest, sensing an opportunity to join the attack now that Arya had broken her pattern of silent acceptance. "I bet they only hired her because of diversity quotas," she said with false sympathy. "No way she's actually qualified for this job. Look at her. She can't even carry a tray without making a mess. How is she supposed to handle real customer service responsibilities?" Each word was carefully chosen to inflict maximum psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability about the speaker's intentions. Madison was an expert at this kind of sophisticated cruelty, able to deliver devastating attacks while maintaining the appearance of reasonable concern about legitimate workplace issues. Arya finished cleaning up the worst of the spill and walked away without another word, carrying the dirty towels toward the back room while the sound of their laughter followed her across the restaurant like a toxic cloud. Other customers watched the interaction with expressions ranging from discomfort to disgust, but as always, no one intervened. The bystander effect was alive and well in the McDonald's on Riverside Boulevard, creating an environment where cruelty could flourish as long as it remained someone else's problem. In the employee break room, Arya stared at her reflection in the small mirror above the sink, taking inventory of the damage from her latest encounter with Blake's group. Her uniform was stained with cola that would probably never come out completely. Her hair was disheveled from kneeling on the floor, and her face was flushed with embarrassment and suppressed anger that she could no longer entirely hide behind her professional mask. She looked like exactly what Blake and his friends believed her to be, a vulnerable target, someone who could be pushed around with impunity, a convenient outlet for their frustrations and prejudices. The reflection staring back at her seemed like a stranger, someone who bore little resemblance to the confident martial artist who had dominated regional competitions for years, or the respected instructor who had helped dozens of students develop both physical skills and personal confidence. But appearances could be deceiving, and the woman in the mirror possessed capabilities that Blake and his friends couldn't begin to imagine. The question was whether she would continue to hide those capabilities in service of a promise that felt increasingly inadequate to address the reality of her situation. As she changed into a spare uniform shirt from her locker, grateful that she had learned to keep backup clothing at work after previous accidents orchestrated by Blake's group, Aria found herself thinking about the young people she had taught back in Cedar Falls. Many of them had come to her classes after being bullied at school, looking for ways to defend themselves and build confidence in the face of harassment and intimidation. She had always taught them that martial arts was about more than fighting. It was about discipline, respect, self-control, and knowing when to walk away from a confrontation. The strongest person in the room, she had often told her students, is not necessarily the one who can hit the hardest. It's the one who has the self-control to choose when and how to use their strength. But what happened when walking away wasn't an option? What happened when the bullies followed you, when they made your workplace into a battlefield, when they turned your daily existence into a source of entertainment for themselves and their social media followers? At what point did endurance become enabling and patience become complicity in your own systematic degradation? These were questions that her grandfather's teachings hadn't fully prepared her for, and the answers seemed to become more elusive with each passing day of harassment. The philosophy of turning the other cheek worked well in theory and in situations where the abuse was occasional or random. But when it became systematic, targeted, and escalating, the strategy of non-resistance seemed to be encouraging rather than discouraging the abusive behavior. The incidents had been escalating gradually over the weeks since Blake's group first identified her as a target. What had started as occasional rude comments had evolved into daily harassment sessions that seemed to grow more creative and more cruel with each iteration. They were clearly enjoying themselves, feeding off each other's energy and competing to see who could devise the most humiliating forms of entertainment at her expense. Blake and his friends began complaining about Aria's service to Kevin on a regular basis, spinning elaborate tales about her rudeness, incompetence, and inability to understand basic customer requests. Their complaints were always carefully crafted to sound legitimate while actually being fabricated or grossly exaggerated versions of normal customer service interactions. Kevin, eager to avoid any potential corporate complaints that might reflect poorly on his management performance, would pull Aria aside after each incident to deliver lectures about customer service excellence and cultural sensitivity that were both condescending and completely irrelevant to the actual situation. "Look, Aria," Kevin had said during one particularly frustrating conversation earlier that week, his tone suggesting that he was being patient with a difficult employee rather than addressing obvious harassment. "I'm not saying they're right about everything, but you need to understand that customer satisfaction is our top priority here. Maybe try to be a little more accommodating, smile more, be friendlier, kill them with kindness, you know?" The advice was well-meaning but ultimately useless, as it failed to address the fundamental reality that no amount of accommodation would satisfy people whose goal was harassment rather than service. Blake and his friends weren't difficult customers with legitimate complaints. They were predators who had identified a vulnerable target and were systematically working to drive her away from her job for their own entertainment. But Arya had nodded and agreed because she needed the job and couldn't afford to alienate her only ally in management, even if that ally was proving to be remarkably ineffective at actually managing the situation. Kevin's suggestion that she kill them with kindness revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the dynamics at play. You couldn't kill predators with kindness any more than you could tame sharks with sympathy. The psychological toll was becoming harder to hide as the weeks progressed. Arya found herself lying awake at night, replaying the day's interactions and analyzing every word and gesture for signs of escalation or opportunities she might have missed to diffuse situations before they became actively harmful. Her appetite decreased significantly, her concentration suffered both at work and during her off hours, and she began to dread each shift with an intensity that surprised her with its physical symptoms. The anxiety manifested in nausea before work, headaches during shifts, and a constant feeling of hypervigilance that followed her even on her days off. She would find herself analyzing strangers' behavior for signs of potential hostility, flinching at unexpected sounds, and feeling nervous in situations that would have seemed perfectly normal just a few months ago. The harassment was changing her in ways that extended far beyond the workplace, affecting her ability to trust, relax, and feel safe in public spaces. Her one source of peace and connection to her true identity came on Thursday evenings when she volunteered at the Riverside Community Center's youth program. For 2 precious hours each week, she was able to reclaim her role as an instructor and mentor, teaching basic self-defense techniques to children from the surrounding neighborhoods who faced their own challenges with bullying and intimidation. The community center was housed in a converted warehouse in one of the city's transitional neighborhoods, an area that was no longer as rough as it had once been, but hadn't yet been completely gentrified by incoming development. The building's exterior was plain and functional, showing the wear and weathering that came from decades of serving a community with limited resources for cosmetic improvements. Inside, however, the center bustled with activity that spoke to the resilience and determination of the people it served. Senior citizens attended fitness classes in one room, while teenagers worked on homework in another. Job training programs ran alongside childcare services, creating an ecosystem of mutual support that reminded Arya of what communities could accomplish when people cared enough to invest in each other's success. The youth program met in a large room with mirrors along one wall and protective mats covering most of the floor space. The room reminded Arya enough of her grandfather's dojo that she could almost imagine herself back in Cedar Falls, surrounded by the familiar sense of canvas and rubber rather than grease and industrial cleaner. The space felt safe and purposeful in ways that contrasted sharply with the hostile environment she navigated during her McDonald's shifts. "Remember," she told her class of 15 young people ranging in age from 8 to 16 during their most recent session, "self-defense is not about being the strongest person in the room. It's about being smart, being aware, and knowing how to protect yourself when other options aren't available." The kids hung on her every word with the kind of attention that reminded her why she had fallen in love with teaching in the first place. They didn't care about her accent or her background. They were too busy learning how to stand with confidence and move with purpose. For them, she wasn't a foreign worker taking American jobs. She was Coach Arya, someone to be respected and emulated, someone whose knowledge and skills could help them navigate their own challenging circumstances. "Coach Arya?" asked Jamie Sullivan, a 13-year-old girl whose parents had enrolled her after a serious bullying incident at school left her afraid to attend classes. "What if someone bigger than you won't leave you alone? Like, what if walking away doesn't work and they keep following you?" The question hit uncomfortably close to home, striking at the heart of Arya's own current struggles with Blake's systematic harassment. She found herself pausing longer than usual before responding, aware that her answer would need to be honest enough to be helpful while also being appropriate for young people who were looking to her for guidance about how to navigate their own difficult situations. "That's a very good question, Jamie," she said carefully, choosing her words with the precision that came from years of teaching students who needed practical advice rather than theoretical philosophy. "The first thing you always try is de-escalation, using your words to calm the situation down and make it clear that you don't want to fight. If that doesn't work, you try to get help from an adult or authority figure who can intervene on your behalf." She paused, looking around at the young faces focused on her with the kind of trust that came from recognizing someone who understood their struggles from personal experience. If those options aren't available and you're in immediate physical danger, then you use the minimum amount of force necessary to escape safely. The goal is never to hurt someone, it's to protect yourself and get away from the dangerous situation. "But what if the adults don't help?" asked Marcus Rodriguez, a 10-year-old whose older brother had brought him to class after he started getting picked on for his size and quiet personality. "What if they just tell you to ignore it or say that boys will be boys?" Again, the questions felt like mirrors, reflecting her own situation back at her with uncomfortable clarity. These children were dealing with the same fundamental problem she was facing: systematic harassment from people who faced no meaningful consequences for their behavior, while the authority figures who were supposed to protect them either couldn't or wouldn't intervene effectively. "Then you keep looking for adults who will help," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "And you remember that your safety is more important than being polite or not making waves. Sometimes standing up for yourself is the only option that works." After class, as Arya was packing up her equipment and preparing to return to her apartment for another night of restless sleep and anxiety about the following day's shift, she noticed Luna Martinez lingering near the doorway. Luna attended school during the week, but worked weekend shifts at McDonald's, and they had developed a quiet friendship based on their shared status as outsiders in the workplace ecosystem. Luna was tall and athletic, with the kind of natural confidence that came from being successful at both academics and sports. Her long dark hair was usually pulled back in a practical ponytail that kept it out of her way during work, and her brown eyes held an intelligence and perceptiveness that made her seem older than her 17 years. She was planning to attend community college in the fall while continuing to work part-time to save money for a 4-year degree, and Arya had developed genuine respect for her work ethic and determination to build a better future for herself. "That was amazing," Luna said as Arya finished packing her gear into the worn duffel bag that had accompanied her through years of competitions and training sessions. "I had no idea you could do all that. I mean, I knew you were really calm and collected at work, but seeing you teach, it's like you're a completely different person." The observation was more accurate than Luna probably realized. The confident instructor who commanded respect and attention in this training room bore little resemblance to the quiet, defensive employee who spent her McDonald's shifts trying to remain invisible and avoid confrontation. The contrast between her two identities was stark enough that sometimes Arya felt like she was living a double life, hiding her true capabilities behind a mask of vulnerability and compliance. "It's just something I've done since I was a kid," Arya said with characteristic modesty, uncomfortable with attention and praise, even when it was genuinely meant and well-deserved. "My grandfather started teaching me when I was 6 years old, and I've been training ever since." "Why don't you ever—" Luna trailed off, looking embarrassed about the question she was about to ask, but clearly struggling with the disconnect between what she had just witnessed and what she observed during their shared work shifts. "Stand up to Blake and his friends," Arya finished for her, recognizing the question that had been building behind Luna's eyes during their brief interactions at work. "It's complicated. "They're awful to you," Luna said quietly, her voice filled with the kind of genuine concern that came from witnessing systematic cruelty and feeling helpless to stop it. "Everyone sees it, and no one says anything. It makes me sick watching them treat you like that. But you're afraid of becoming their next target if you speak up." Arya completed the thought with understanding rather than judgment. She had observed the same pattern among all her co-workers. They recognized the harassment, disapproved of it, but were unwilling to risk their own safety or job security by intervening on her behalf. Luna's face flushed with shame and frustration. "I'm sorry. I know that's hypocritical and cowardly. We're all afraid of becoming their next target if we speak up, but watching them do that to you every day—" "It's okay," Arya said gently, though she appreciated Luna's honesty about the difficult position she was in. "I understand the dynamics that keep people silent. But can I ask you something? If someone was treating you the way they treat me, would you want people to speak up?" Luna nodded immediately without any hesitation. "Of course. But it's different when it's happening to someone else, isn't it? It's easier to tell yourself it's not your responsibility, or that maybe it's not as bad as it looks from the outside." The admission was brutally honest and more insightful than many adults would have been capable of making. Luna understood the psychology of bystander behavior well enough to recognize her own complicity, while also acknowledging the very real risks that came with intervention in hostile workplace situations. "I made a promise to my grandfather that I wouldn't use my training for anything but defense and competition," Arya explained, sitting down on one of the benches that lined the training room walls. "He was worried that I would come to America and get into trouble by fighting, but watching you teach those kids tonight, it made me wonder if maybe there are different kinds of fighting." "What do you mean?" Luna asked, settling onto the bench beside her with the kind of careful attention that suggested she understood this was an important conversation. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man," Luna said thoughtfully, after Arya had explained some of the background behind her commitment to avoiding conflict. "But isn't defending yourself from harassment a form of self-defense? They're attacking you. Not physically yet, but they're still attacking you." The question cut to the heart of Arya's internal struggle and forced her to confront the contradictions in her own thinking about when the use of force was justified. Her grandfather's teachings had been shaped by his own experiences as an immigrant in a different era, when the consequences of fighting back against discrimination could be far more severe than they were today. But the world had changed in the decades since his arrival in America, and the forms that harassment and intimidation took had evolved as well. Blake and his friends weren't wearing white hoods or burning crosses. They were using social media, economic pressure, and psychological warfare to achieve the same fundamental goal of making unwanted people feel unwelcome and eventually forcing them to leave. The conversation stayed with Arya long after she returned to her small studio apartment that night. She lived on the third floor of a converted Victorian house that had been divided into individual units for students and young professionals who couldn't afford more expensive housing options. Her space was barely large enough for a bed, a small kitchenette, and a desk where she kept her laptop and the few books she had brought with her from Cedar Falls. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbors' conversations, television shows, and late-night phone calls, but the lack of privacy was offset by rent that was just barely within her budget on a fast food salary. The location was convenient to both her job and the community center, allowing her to walk to work and volunteer obligations without relying on public transportation that could be unreliable or expensive. As she went through her nightly routine, a series of stretches and meditation exercises that helped her process the day's stress and prepare for sleep, Arya found herself questioning assumptions she had held for months about the nature of strength, self-defense, and moral obligation. Was her refusal to fight back actually a form of strength, Or was it enabling Blake and his friends to continue their behavior with impunity? How many other employees had they harassed before her arrival at McDonald's? How many more would they target after she inevitably quit or got fired? By absorbing their abuse without consequences, was she actually contributing to a cycle of harassment that would continue to harm other vulnerable workers long after she had moved on to other employment? The questions followed her into restless sleep, where her dreams were filled with scenarios where she finally fought back, using her skills to defend not just herself, but all the other vulnerable workers who had been forced to endure similar treatment from people like Blake and his friends. She woke feeling more tired than when she had gone to bed, but also with a growing sense that something fundamental in her approach to the situation was about to change. The change began to crystallize the following morning as she prepared for another shift at McDonald's, standing before the cracked mirror in her tiny bathroom and practicing the smile that Kevin had suggested would solve all her customer service problems. The expression felt more forced and artificial with each repetition, a mask that was becoming harder to maintain as the psychological cost of wearing it continued to accumulate. Looking at her reflection, Arya realized that she had been thinking about the situation backwards. Instead of asking herself why she should fight back, she should be asking herself why she shouldn't. What exactly was she protecting by continuing to absorb abuse that was escalating rather than decreasing? What promise was she really honoring? And at what point did that promise become a chain that bound her to accepting treatment that no human being should have to endure? Her grandfather had taught her that true strength came from self-control, but he had also taught her that self-control was meaningless without the ability to choose between different options. If she could only respond to harassment with passive acceptance, then she wasn't demonstrating strength. She was demonstrating powerlessness disguised as virtue. The insight felt both liberating and terrifying as she walked to work that morning, knowing that Blake and his friends would almost certainly appear for their regular harassment session, and wondering whether today might be the day when her response would finally be different. The old Arya, the one who had been trying to disappear into the background of her own life, felt like she was beginning to fade away, replaced by someone who was tired of being afraid and ready to reclaim the confidence that had been systematically stripped away over weeks of systematic psychological warfare. The morning shift passed without incident, giving Arya time to observe the restaurant's dynamics with fresh eyes and consider the various ways a confrontation might unfold if and when she decided to stop accepting Blake's harassment without resistance. She noticed details that had escaped her attention during previous shifts: the positioning of security cameras, the sight lines between different areas of the restaurant, the typical customer traffic patterns during different times of day. More importantly, she began to notice the subtle ways that Blake's behavior affected everyone in the restaurant, not just her. Other customers grew visibly uncomfortable during his harassment sessions, finishing their meals quickly and leaving rather than remaining in the toxic atmosphere he created. Her co-workers became tense and nervous when his group arrived, affecting their performance and their interactions with other customers. Kevin's strategy of hiding in his office during confrontations meant that the restaurant operated without effective management during some of its busiest periods, creating additional stress for employees who were left to handle difficult situations without support or guidance. The entire ecosystem of the workplace had been disrupted by Blake's presence, but no one seemed willing or able to address the root cause of the problem. As the lunch rush began to build and Arya prepared herself for whatever the afternoon might bring, she found herself thinking about the young people in her self-defense classes and the advice she had given them about knowing when to stand up for themselves. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was teaching children to be braver than she had been willing to be in her own life, but perhaps that was about to change. Perhaps today would be the day when the quiet young woman behind the McDonald's counter would finally reveal that she was much more than Blake and his friends had ever imagined, and that some people were far more dangerous when they were quiet than when they were loud. The lunch rush was building toward its peak when Arya heard the familiar electronic chime that announced the arrival of new customers. She looked up from the register where she had been processing orders for a steady stream of office workers and construction crews, and her stomach immediately clenched with the familiar combination of dread and anticipation that had become her automatic response to seeing Blake Morrison's distinctive silhouette in the doorway. But today felt different somehow. Instead of the usual sinking sensation of helplessness and resignation, Arya felt something else stirring beneath the surface, a sense of readiness, of potential energy waiting to be released. The quiet resignation that had characterized her previous encounters with Blake's group was beginning to give way to something that felt more like focused anticipation. Blake swaggered through the entrance with his typical aggressive confidence, his faded varsity jacket catching the artificial light and his pale blue eyes scanning the restaurant like a predator returning to familiar hunting grounds. Behind him trailed Ethan Walsh with his phone already in hand, and Madison Pierce with her perfectly applied makeup and expression of anticipatory malice. Together, they represented the same toxic combination that had made Arya's life miserable for weeks. But something in her perception of them had shifted overnight. Instead of seeing them as threats to be endured, she was beginning to see them as problems to be solved. And Arya had always been very good at solving problems, especially the kind that required precise application of technique and timing.